Good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Churches, CEO of AUW. We're so grateful you could join us this evening for a terrific conversation on creating inclusive perspectives in every part of our society and really how it's impacting the workforce, education, and leadership pipelines, not just during the COVID-19 pandemic, but overall and systemically throughout our society. Inclusion can be measured by a sense of belonging, connection, and community in the workplace. It's really about how you feel connected to your workplace and the people around you. But so many organizations talk a good game, but still lack a prioritization of diversity, equity, inclusion throughout their organization. Or they simply work on counting diversity just by numbers without creating inclusivity top to bottom and side to side, and never really working to improve culture and improve inclusivity. So I am delighted that tonight we have some fantastic panelists that are going to be joining us in conversation in a wide variety of sectors, from STEM, energy, and oil to the nonprofit sector, because frankly, it's not just in the private sector that we have to make sure that we are eliminating barriers and biases and improving diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's throughout all of society. Now, I really would like to especially thank API for their support of our webinar series, and I'm so pleased we're going to be able to have an honest and candid dialogue tonight about how our sectors are working to engage DEI work with increased accountability and commitment. And, I know as all of us have thought about our own times in education, in the workforce, in our community and leadership roles, volunteer roles, and what have you, sometimes we don't always feel valued. But can you imagine feeling good and living with purpose if you didn't feel valued by your own employer, or if you didn't feel safe actually living your authentic self in the workplace because of a dominant culture bearing down on you? And it's not just happening during the pandemic. This has been happening for hundreds of years of systemic and structural racism in our society and misogyny in the workplace. So we really, truly want to address those critical needs for including perspectives in our workplace tonight. And I especially, again, want to say thank you to API for your support. Let me go ahead and introduce to you our panelists for this evening. And we do have Tysley Williams, who has joined us as the Chief Development Officer for America's Promise Alliance. Tysley has been inspiring individuals and organizations and has invested more than $100 million of fundraising prowess for charitable causes. As the Chief Development Officer for America's Promise Alliance, she leads contributed and earned income strategies for the largest alliance of youth-serving organizations in the U.S. today. But for almost 25 years, Tysley has been advancing philanthropy in so many executive leadership positions, such as at YWCA USA, the American Red Cross, the YMCA, and so many others. And I love this about Tysley, and it exactly sums up who she is. She's a joyful divorcee who enjoys taste testing fried green tomatoes and conversing with values-driven leaders in preparation for her first book. I've known Tysley for many, many years. She's also one of the leading voices in the nonprofit sector, ensuring that we're leading not just with words, but with actions to better improve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the nonprofit sector. So welcome, Tysley. We also have with us this evening Rebecca Winkle, who is a member of the API's Regulatory and Economic Policy Group. Rebecca works to ensure that API's research is of the highest quality and is the policy lead on workforce and education issues for API, responsible for directing all research and many of the programs and partnerships related to workforce development in the field. And that includes topics like employment, educational attainment, building trades and labor unions, supplier diversity, and workforce development issues for communities of color, for women, for veterans, and millennials. We're so delighted Rebecca could be with us tonight. Thank you, Rebecca. And lastly, we have Shaila Rao Mistry, who is president of JCO MMI, an aerospace medical device company. Shaila is also the founder and CEO of the STEM Institute for Organizational Growth, Leadership Development, Strategic Planning, and Foresight Institute. She has truly deep experience in economic development and advancement from many perspectives, from small business to HR to strategic development to talent management, policy and advocacy at a national level and an international level. And she really has been working on these issues globally, not just here in the US, including work on fair pay and decent work places, trafficking, and digital human rights online. She's a well sought after speaker. She serves on a lot of national and international boards, and she is also one of our AUW national board members. Welcome to Shyla. So thank you all so much for joining us. So as we're talking about inclusivity, as we're talking about intersectionalities, as we're talking about how to ensure that people can live their authentic selves and that we can meet the demography where we are today, not the past ways of working in the 19th and 20th century. Rebecca, I want to let us first turn to you to tell us a little bit about the industry in which you work and where you think it stands today on DEI efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And do you believe API is beginning to address the gap in inclusive perspectives?
Those are great questions, Kim, and thank you so much for having me with you this evening. I am honored to be part of this panel and have this important conversation. This quest, I would say, to create inclusive perspectives and really to address all of the pieces of diversity and equity and inclusion really is a journey. And for us at API and for the industry broadly, the oil and natural gas industry, it's a journey that we are committed to and that we have been on for a number of years, learning and growing and tweaking and changing as we are navigating how this should work and what we need to understand and what practices we need to implement. And I think that it's important when we talk about addressing some of these gaps that we first take a step back and do the work to really understand what those gaps are. And you mentioned I sit in our Regulatory and Economic Policy Division at API. I am a researcher by training. My background is in economics and public policy. And that analytical framework really informs the way that we've approached all of this at API. And I have to say, I use the AAUW resources quite a bit because you also have excellent research that helps inform all of the work that we're all trying to do. So for us at API, over the last about 10 years, we have built out a large suite of qualitative and quantitative research to help us better understand our workforce, our current workforce, as well as our future workforce needs and opportunities, and how diverse communities and perspectives has to play a meaningful part in that. For example, last summer, we released a study that I call our Future of Work study. When we talk about workforce and job opportunities, this idea about the future of work and the changing nature of work and the role of technology in that is really driving the conversation. And so this study looked at digital and automation technologies in particular, and how those are changing the nature of work within the oil and gas industry, and what the implications of that are for our employees and for the types of skills that we expect to need, for the number of opportunities that we expect to have, and then what are those impacts for underrepresented groups in particular. So we break this out looking at women, looking at Hispanic workers, Black workers, Asian workers, and others who identify as non-white. And we found that in 2019, and so this is pre-COVID data, but we found that in 2019, the oil and natural gas and petrochemical industries directly employed about 2 million people in the United States. And close to half of those are women and BIPOC workers. And looking forward over the next about 2 decades, we project the need to fill about 1.9 million job opportunities. And women and BIPOC workers are projected to fill about 60% of those. But it's important to understand when we talk about closing gaps that sometimes the overarching numbers can belie great variation within demographic sectors. And you see that when you break out specific occupation types within our industry. So for example, we have close to 600,000 women who work in professional fields like engineering and geosciences. However, men still outnumber women nearly 4-1 in those occupations. And that is actually consistent with a RAND Corporation report from 2017 that found that men outnumbered women 4-1, so looking at the same ratio, in earning bachelor's degrees in oil and natural gas related fields like petroleum, chemical, mechanical engineering, geosciences, and cartography. So this kind of research really helps us understand the specifics of the barriers that we face to help us know where to focus our efforts. And as you noted, I think rather importantly, diversity in numbers is not necessarily the same thing as being inclusive and equitable, though it's an important step in that process. So we've also done quite a bit of qualitative work to understand employment drivers for women and for diverse communities and how they view working for this industry. And from that, we've come to understand the really significant role that awareness of opportunities and cultural perceptions and specific regional perceptions, how big of a role those things play in attracting and retaining and growing diverse talent. So, of course, all of that research only matters if we can turn it into actionable steps. And so we use our research as a foundation to direct our outreach, our partnerships, our programmatic and policy work to, as you said, close the gap. And we do that with both an internal and an external lens. So, for example, we have an internal group called the Diversity Advisory Committee, the DAC, that reviews and sets API's DE&I goals. And it provides a forum for individuals to share their perspectives and experiences and to raise concerns. That's an internal focus that we need to do to make sure that we are an inclusive organization. Externally, we also partner with a number of organizations through our Energy Action Alliance, or EAA, which is a group of valued external stakeholder organizations like the American Association of Blacks in Energy and Hispanics in Energy that provide us counsel and feedback as we work to be more inclusive. So these kinds of partnerships, and there are lots of examples, but these kinds of partnerships, I think, provide important opportunities for real listening to take place and then give us avenues to take action. And that, in combination with a growing understanding of where we are and what those barriers for progress are, is really how we are coming at addressing some of these gaps.
That's great, Rebecca. Thanks so much. And I'll just say that, we talk about this a lot at AUW around both the pay gap and the leadership gaps that we see in all parts of society, and that without that quantitative coupled with the qualitative lens and regular auditing, regular checking to see where you are, knowing where you are and where you're going are the only ways to really start to remove some of those barriers and biases that exist. And frankly, ensuring that there's not occupational segregation, leadership segregation, educational segregation that can all play a role in this from high school on up. So really appreciate your comments. Thanks so much. Shyla, let's turn to you. You've been obviously a leader in the STEM sector. You're certainly an entrepreneur, been deeply engaged with the United Nations for years. So talk to us a little bit about when an organization does not demonstrate an inclusive perspective, how is that experienced by women and BIPOC individuals? What are some of those experiences that we can think about? Oh, mute.
I apologize. Thank you, Kim, for inviting me to this panel. It's indeed an honor to be here. And thank you, Rebecca, for laying that contextual framework out. It's really inspiring to hear all the keywords of technology, leadership, commitment, research, because that's the world I live in, the hard facts and making things happen, the reality. That's what entrepreneurs do. It's a reality. So let me explain how we see things. A non-inclusive perspective means that we implicitly and complicitly exclude women at multi-levels. And this is happening in all sectors, including high decision-making. Now, this systemic inequity and exclusion affects us in three overarching themes, not spaces, but themes. The first is access to opportunity of education, jobs, health, and respect. And facing challenges in the workplace and work environment of restricted advancement and inequity of pay. This is very transparent that this is happening. And being excluded, this is very important, excluded from participation in the process of change and decision making. For me, inclusion and equity is being part of that high decision making. This means leading with social responsibility alongside all the other leaders in other sectors of public and private, and this is not happening. And it means being included in intersectional collaboration, increased awareness of hidden biases, and action for intentional gender equity. These are the things that need to happen and are not happening, and contribute to those three areas of exclusion we talked about. As to contextual examples I can share with you, at the UN Commission on Status of Women just this March 2021 was themed Women in High Decision Making. 27,000 women globally assembled virtually to declare their readiness to lead and to strategize to move forward. And through technology, we united. We heard each other's voices, and we were heard by decision makers. It was pretty amazing. Never done before. However, there's always a however. Our efforts are great, but our gains are incremental and painfully slow. And we need to do more to hit the right spots for the systemic change to open up global inclusion. And so too with the UN Global Compact, which is also very heavily committed to inclusion, is not as diverse as we would expect it to be. And serving as a participant leader on climate and health, decent work and fair pay and equity, that's SDGs 3, 5, and 8, we still see a skewed underrepresentation. These are all the effects of exclusion. I can talk more, but my second example is also that of STEM, our STEM. First, as we all know, small businesses make up 51% of all businesses. They're a majority, actually. And 39% are women-owned, so like me. And in 2020, with COVID, we've seen that BIPOC is disproportionately affected, with 40% of businesses lost, they went under. That's disproportionate. Now, our STEM journey was to aggressively advance from breaking the glass ceiling to getting a seat at the table and very quickly discovering that this is not enough. So we just went ahead to build our own entity. And that's what women are doing. What does STEM do? What do we need? STEM gives a voice and a platform for leaders to build organizations, to establish pathways for success. We need more of those success models. And we need to create pathways for them to break stereotypes and biases and to be inclusive, to facilitate collaboration. And I know Rebecca's talked a lot about collaboration. That's really important between all sectors. All sectors are important. And to advance the case of women leaders, which we're doing, but obviously it's not enough and our voice is not being heard yet, so we need to do more. And for diversity leaders to shape the outcomes. We need access to shape the outcomes, and we need to shape them. So we need to invest in positive societal action that begins and continues with all of us. It starts here.
It does.
Thank you, Kim.
Shaila. Thank you. That's a lot there to unpack and appreciate both your perspective at a global level at the UN as well as in your day job. And, just to reiterate a couple things you said there, we've already known, and we talked about this in a previous webinar, of how little venture capital is available to BIPOC and entrepreneurs and women entrepreneurs. And then when you're faced without the access to the same level of loans, perhaps the banks aren't calling you back at the same rate as well, so that you're just so disproportionately behind the eight ball constantly, and you enter a global pandemic and a global economic downturn, it can be just far, far too much. So that banding together about how to remove those biases is going to be key. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we continue the discussion, because I'd be interested too, for all three of you, this is something to noodle on in a couple minutes here as I get to Tysley, is really, it's not just the pipelines or the hiring for those initial jobs. It's also, how we're addressing retention and attrition issues and promotion practices to make sure that we're eliminating those biases, exactly as Shyla said, complicit and implicit. So Tysley, to you, you have truly been a powerful national leadership voice in the nonprofit sector and the philanthropy world for a long, long time. But I will say, assuredly, and not just over this past year, but for the past 2 or 3 years, your voice has really elevated around diversity, equity, and inclusion in that third sector, in the nonprofit sector in the US. Talk to me a little bit about why you think now is the time to be elevating these voices and why this work is so critically important to you.
Yes, Kim, thank you for the opportunity. It's great to be here, and I'm learning so much from the very wise women that you have assembled today. So, Rebecca and Shyla, thank you. So, I'm just going to do a bit of level setting, because when you say not for profit sector, people are like, oh, that's nice. Those are the people down the street doing really kind things for my grandmother or for my niece. We are actually fueling up 11.4 million jobs annually here in the States. And we account for the third largest workforce, only behind retail and manufacturing. And so when you think of who and what the not-for-profit sector is, we not only provide jobs, but much of where you go for entertainment. Chances are you go to a museum. Chances are you're checking out a play. Chances are you are also going to a place of worship. And so there are millions upon millions of people who also turn to not-for-profit organizations for entertainment, for inspiration, for education. And so it is so critically important within our sector for us to meet the varying needs of those that we are providing services to and of those we are supporting. The piece that I'll extend, Kim, which I think is really important about my personal identity, you shared a lot in that bio, and I was really grateful that you lifted up the personal elements, because what we're really talking about today is how individual beliefs influence behavior. And we're also talking about how we as individuals parachute into institutions to drive systemic change. One thing that wasn't disclosed on my professional bio, and I actually need to include this, is that I am a descendant of slaves. Not every Black person that you meet comes from slaves. For me, when I think of diversity, equity, access, it is a very literal actualization of the principles that were beyond reach for my ancestors. And so when I think about parity, I think back just 3 generations, mind you, to my ancestors who worked without one single ounce of compensation. And so for me, it is so critically important, especially under the principles in which we cherish as Americans, for our audio to match the video. I would be okay, Kim, if we were not saying that this is about life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice, right? I would be okay with the inequity. It would bother me, and I would have reasons to say, hey, things should be different. But especially when we have foundational elements that we all share and cherish, and we have yet to actualize those things, whether it's in the boardroom, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's en route to those things. It is just so critically important, Kim, for all of us to be very committed, not just to doing what we can when we show up in the workplace, but doing what we can when we show up as volunteers, doing what we can when we show up as family members. Bias and stereotypes exist. I mean, even as someone who identifies as a Black woman, I am a product of an environment that has attempted to teach me when I see the Black boys approaching my car that I should immediately feel fearful. I know because of my lived experience being close to my cousins, there is no reason to fear a Black boy or a Black man. But that is something that I had to fight against, and I have to consistently fight against. And I think the same is true for all of us when we find ourselves in situations where we have individual power. I have to consistently ensure that I am pushing forth the same element of rights and responsibilities for all members of my team, regardless of their gender. It is so easy for me to say, oh, yes, Ben, that was an exceptional display of assertion. And at the same time, I have to ensure that I'm also encouraging Elena to also be equally as assertive and not to qualify her response as negative and his response as positive when the exact same action has occurred. And so, Kim, I'm really excited that we're digging into some interesting conversations and all that's going on in the workplace, because I think there's just an opportunity to continue the conversation and continue to just learn from our own lived experiences.
Thank you, Tysley, so much. And thanks also for their perspective, because I think you're right on the nonprofit sector that too often we think of it as puppies and kittens and what we're doing for children after school or any variety of issues, but knowing that at the macro level, how it's fueling our economy, fueling jobs, fueling connectivity and community means that we do need to hold the nonprofit sector accountable as well in all of this work. So let's turn for a second here, and I do want to get back to kind of the personal roles that Tysley just mentioned and Shyla touched on as well. But I want to pull on something we were talking about with Rebecca in the beginning of the conversation. You know, she was talking a little bit about the hiring platforms for API going forward and where you're seeing where the jobs are going to go and what's to come in the future for BIPOC and women in the fields. So Rebecca, let's talk a little bit about that in terms of senior leadership. You know, the C-suite and decision making at the board level, the C-suite, senior VP level and the like. Anything kind of from director and up is really leading a lot of these charges. So let's see about how are you thinking about that work when you're talking about the tremendous growth of potential jobs on the forecast in the field? What are some of the implications if DEI is not prioritized at the top levels, and how does that trickle all the way to, you know, entry level hiring? So how are you thinking about really promotion practices overall and retention?
Those are big questions, Kim, and I love them. I think to take them kind of a piece at a time, I think that DE&I work is, when you said, you know, this senior leadership who is kind of directing or leading some of this work, I think that oftentimes people who are maybe outside of the space think DE&I, that belongs in our HR group, and that's kind of where it can live and stay. Well, DE&I work is not something that just belongs to one department or one group. It matters in every part of an organization, and it permeates across the entire culture. But the attitude about how we feel as an organization about DE&I, that attitude is set at the top. And so without senior leadership champions, meaningful change is going to be difficult to come by, both internally for an organization and externally for the customers or the constituents who we serve. And so I think that the research that I talked about earlier and an understanding of the changing demographics of the country, an understanding of the social and political and environmental and economic climates that we face right now. All of those things really necessitate prioritization of these issues. And there are clear documented benefits for the business case of DEI. But I think that for those of us who would maybe call ourselves DEI champions, or in another panel I sat on, they termed us equity warriors. And I thought, oh, I love that. But as equity warriors, we need to help demonstrate to that senior leadership how the incentives here are aligned. And so how we as an organization do better when we prioritize these issues. And when executives understand that, they are able to move resources, to convene people, and to really set the tone for the rest of the organization or industry. So for example, for us, we have member company task forces. So API is a trade association made up of member companies in the oil and gas industry. And so we have member company task forces that focus on workforce and supplier diversity. And those are driven at the executive level, and that's why they work. But without some of that intentional, and Shyla mentioned intentional earlier, which is one of my very favorite words, without that intentional executive support, DEI can fall by the wayside, or perhaps worse, can be something that we do in name only without really affecting meaningful change. And when we think about promotion practices in particular, I think we need to be very careful about some of the cultural and social norms that Teisley was mentioning. There's a lot of good research about gender group dynamics and about what happens when women don't speak up. And it's interesting to see that when you are sitting in some of these councils, excellence, which oftentimes as women, we think it's fine because I'll just be the best and then I will be valued and validated. Excellence is not enough to overcome these structural and systemic challenges that we face. And so when you look at the number of women in the room or the number of BIPOC individuals there, when you look at how people are responding to them, positive versus negative affirmations and interruptions, saying something as simple as, oh, that's a really interesting idea, that shows value and provides empowerment to that woman or underrepresented person who made that comment, and also to the group as a whole. And so that needs to be happening in our leadership councils so that it can be modeled for all of our teams and hopefully help to create that inclusive pipeline and pathway up through an organization.
Yeah, really great points, Rebecca. And you pulled on a couple of really key themes here about how to actually demonstrate inclusive leadership every day and pure action, as well as how to hold leaders accountable, because it's all good and fine to be talking about things or laying out values, on a sheet of paper and tacking up on the old-fashioned bulletin board. It's another thing to live it in how we're holding our leaders accountable in those situations. And I've sat on search committees far too often where I'm the only female on the committee to kind of check a box, and just somehow culturally the white guy named John is the one who's promoted because he just seems to fit. And I think a lot of this is asking a lot of those questions about, why do we believe John fits and not Diane or Shyla or Teisley or Rebecca, right? Why is it that we think that we look at a leader and we think of it demonstrating these types of roles? And I think Teisley, as you were describing that too, of we all have those biases that Shyla mentioned before as well, of how to kind of check that at the door and go, well, why is it that I'm applauding the gentleman on my team for his assertions, but I'm not applauding the female on my team for the same assertions? And how are we ensuring that we're determining, how to reframe dominant culture in a way that everybody can play to their strengths? Really great points. Thanks, Rebecca, very much. Shyla, I want to actually shift a little bit and talk because of some of the things that you talked a little bit about in your opening remarks about how we can kind of promote more of those open and honest dialogues about inclusive perspectives in STEM fields. And I'm, STEM is a giant macro topic. I mean, obviously, Rebecca's industry is very much in oil, gas, and discovery, and science is very much involved in STEM. But as you disaggregate STEM, there are still a couple of big areas in STEM where women and BIPOC are still just sadly and woefully underrepresented and are even stagnated or falling off, and primarily in computer science and tech and others. So how hard is it to you, Shyla, to kind of change cultural systems and really think differently about open, honest dialogues in STEM so that we can promote better inclusion? What do you think needs to be done first?
Whether we are just, first of all, I want to thank Rebecca for pointing out the concept of DEI belonging with HR. We have a concept and we applied it throughout our industry and our entity, which is quality. People thought quality was at the end, it was inspected at the end. And we changed that paradigm and said quality starts every step of the way. It's everybody's responsibility. Now, on the issue of STEM and how we bring up awareness, expose those biases, and what is it that we can do, regardless of whether it is in STEM or in any other field, I think the path is still the same. The only thing that I will say in STEM is that there is a lot more measurement that is possible. And I will refer to that a little bit later. Measurement of where we were, what are the results, and where are we going? So coming back to the point about the biases and on an individual level and what we can do about that. So there is implicit, as we all know, and unconscious bias on which is learned, stereotyped, and attitudes which are unintentional, inbuilt, and affect all our decision making. We don't realize this. We live in a world, we don't need proof that this happens because we live in a world where it is inequitable in so many aspects. So what happens is that it's a tendency for people to connect with others who share similar backgrounds, experiences, and interests with serious implications. It looks fair enough. Okay, I relate with Jane who has similar interests and so on. That doesn't look so bad on the surface of it and maybe fine. But how does that affect my decision making and selection of people for top resources? Primary exclusions that we see, whether it's in STEM or any other field, is at the two intersectional dynamics of career level and high decision making. And I keep touching on high decision making because unless we have diversity, women at that high level to make better policies and have good governance, that same thinking is going to permeate. And the hidden biases and preferences will continue to exist. And we maintain the status quo. So as an example of women on boards, the work I've done on women on boards for years, men have excluded us from recruiting board members because they recruit board members who look like themselves and thus keep boards white and male. So we need to change the paradigm. Again, this applies in STEM as anywhere else. So what did we do? In California, we passed legislation on inclusion of women on boards. So suddenly we see NASDAQ, Goldman Sachs requiring public companies to have at least one woman on the board. One is not enough. We need 3 to have effective action. I would say 51% or even more. And then also making that case for women and diversity boards. Our research, everybody's research has shown the boards with diversity and women are more successful both financially and in creating better work environments. And that's so important. And to benefit the community. We know this. And also, this applies across the board to increase our awareness of intersectionality. And as Dr. Crenshaw termed it, to guard against those identity markers that are being used to exclude diversity from desired jobs, education and respect, and as Kim pointed out, access to capital. As STEM, we've been working heavily over this last year on getting that access to women-owned businesses, diversity-owned businesses, and small businesses. That's also a minority. And also, it's important to have those honest conversations and commit to deep listening and understanding, as talked about by Ibram Kendi in his book on how to be an anti-racist. I think people are not listening. You know, they all say they're listening, but I don't think they're listening. If they were listening, we wouldn't be in this place. We would be much further along. So I think that listening needs to happen. And then sharing from running my two entities in aerospace, medical device, and in my STEM institute, manufacturing and multi-sectoral experience. We are proud to announce that we uphold equity and inclusion, always have. And we do business with clients and companies and vendors who are also uphold the same standards. And this can only happen with commitment from top management, CEOs, owners, where we train people, top managers, for values of equity. That needs to happen. Best practices and good governance. And zero, this is important, zero tolerance towards biases.
Yeah.
That needs to happen. And critically, and I know Rebecca mentioned this also, critically, we need to be intentional in building the future. Unfortunately, it has to happen in bite sizes. We're not satisfied with that, but that's how it has to happen. Hiring practices, HR talent, needs to prioritize skills as the drivers for candidate selection, skills, and not allow biases and identity markers to influence selection.
Yeah.
And the second critical factor is to instruct key directors to be intentional, inclusive in the slate of candidates. If they never present the slate of candidates and they only present John and Jack, how are we ever going to be diverse? And targeting to always have a pipeline of candidates trained and ready for leadership, because what's said about us, about women, is that we don't want to lead because we like soft, fluffy cats. We're not ready to lead, and there aren't any candidates. These are the popular misnomers. And I will say that as an example, as participants of the UNGC leadership, we, STEM, has undertaken economic outreach work to train and model these standards to influence primes and suppliers. So these are some of the things that can be done and need to be done.
Thanks, Shaila, so much. Boy, a lot of to-do lists there. I really appreciate it. We are starting to get some questions into the Q&A box, and just want to remind our audience tonight that you can go ahead and type those in at the bottom right of the Q&A box, and we'll get to you in just a couple seconds. And you know, something else you said, Shaila, there about how we do want more BIPOC and women leaders throughout organizations so we can get to that high-level decision-making. But the truth is, white men are representing more than 85% of the Fortune 500 CEOs, and will be critical. We need to actually ally, right, with men. We cannot do this. We're four women here identifying as women on this panel this evening, but we also know we need to partner with men in really dismantling the old cultures and building back workplaces that work for everybody. Again, not just to survive, but to thrive in creating more inclusive workplaces. So, Tysley, I do want to, touch. We've been talking a lot of this at the macro level, and I want to get a little bit personal here, if that's all right with you, because you gave such a brave and really candid interview with the Chronicle of Philanthropy about your leadership roles, and you've been in very senior nonprofit leadership roles throughout your career. What do you think leaders that are a part of a dominant culture, so in our society here of a white male dominant culture in the workplace, need to be doing to ensure greater diversity and allowing folks to be themselves, and as well as allowing folks to be much more authentic in the roles that they occupy? And I'm sure you're going to touch on something Shaila just said, which is active listening skills, which I've been doing on this call this evening with all of you and learning so much from all of you. But talk to us a little bit about why you decided to come forward with your stories for the Chronicle in that important interview recently.
Absolutely. So I want to extend a lot of what Shyla has beautifully introed. I think it's critically important if we say we are open to diversifying, that Tysley's going to do things very differently than John. Tysley brings a unique experience. And to Shyla's point, not only does she have skill sets, but her lived experiences and her intersectional identity produces a different mindset.
Hmm.
And so when I bring my full authentic self, born in the Deep South, descendant of slaves, dad was a principal, mom, school teacher. While I have grown up educated alongside of white children, the way in which that education landed and the way in which I utilize that education is very different than Jane and John. So I think the first thing is being really sensitive to qualifying different as being bad. And we have a tendency to see the world in either or, black or white. So when I stepped into the American Red Cross, it was an organization that was very near and dear to my heart. Growing up in Alabama, 10 months out of the year, we experienced tornadoes. Since 1975, the American Red Cross and volunteers have rebuilt my community 4 times. So before I know anything about the structural leadership of the American Red Cross, I know a lot about the need for the American Red Cross. And the need is what enables it to be in the marketplace. If there were not a need for you to build back the community, you would not be showing up in places and spaces during disasters to aid and assist. So there is something for you to learn from the people who have an understanding of the need that is very different than the theoretical manner in which you have been exposed to it. So I found myself in my first C-suite position at the age of 40, and I was super excited about the opportunity. I had a team of 12 frontline fundraisers that I was leading. There was a lot of change going on at the American Red Cross. They were going from being a federated model to centralizing everything under one construct. So you can imagine that separate and apart from here comes the new Black girl who's going to be the chief development officer in DC, which is one of the 10 largest regions, there were a plethora of things unfolding, right? And lots of systemic issues that they were trying to right set. In the midst of that, there was also an attempt to ensure that those of us who were leaders of color, in particular Black leaders, that we were centering internally the way you have these internal conversations when the Chronicle of Philanthropy is not listening and you're like, hey, we need to chat. We are not supported. You want me to build the Brooklyn Bridge, but you're giving me a hammer. I need a little bit more than a hammer and nails to build the Brooklyn Bridge. And so there were all of these internal conversations going on. And needless to say, there was a very triggering, traumatic experience that I went through. And during that time, I really gave thought to, do I speak on this or do I pause and reflect? It is so unfortunate that when women and Black people find ourselves being mistreated, we step into places and spaces where we're trying to protect brands, individuals, other leaders who were actually the offenders. And so I opted at that time not to disclose, share, shed light, because I was more concerned with how it would negatively impact a brand that mattered to me and mattered to people in my community. And so I sat in silence. And what pushed me from silence to speaking, it has been young people. So shortly after Breonna Taylor, young Black women in my office began to knock on my door and having conversations about the things that were happening to Black women. And I began giving them advice about the importance of activating courage and why you needed to use your power and all of these things that I would say to my younger self. And I realized and recognized that I was not holding, Shyla, I wasn't holding my power in my leadership position. And that's a whole nother question, Kim, about why I was or wasn't doing that, right? But I wasn't. I was giving advice to others, trying to stand up in support of the young Black women in my office and other places and spaces, but not feeling as if I was able to practice what I was preaching. And so during a conversation, I said, from here on out, when asked about any situation or circumstance, I'm going to speak to it in order to help others learn from it. And it isn't about making the X company look bad, and it isn't about bringing shame or being disloyal. It is about centering statements of fact and recognizing that if I truly care about any institution or any of us, we've got to have the courage to be honest. And when I got the call, I said, I am going to speak on the experience because, the grapevine of Washington is one where it had been, in the streets. I had never spoken to it. And after the reporter interviewed me, she said, may I reference your employer, or are you more comfortable with saying her former employer? And I said, well, I don't want to crash LinkedIn, right? With everybody running over to see who is her former employer that she had. It was the American Red Cross. And I said, absolutely, feel free to reference that. And so, Kim, it does get personal. And as Shyla and Rebecca and you, we are all testaments to this. This is not easy. We are sitting here today interjecting sound bites.
Yeah.
But when Shyla is the only one at the board table, it gets real fast.
Yeah.
The same with Rebecca. It's isolating. It's emotionally draining. It is not easy, but I will say we are making gains. It is not perfect, but we are making progress.
Tysley, goodness, your bravery, your honesty, your candor, and that ability to have exceedingly difficult conversations about knowing where we are, where we're going, and who we're excluding in our workplaces, in our communities, in our circles of influence, et cetera. It is a lot. And the burden here also, I think it's important to share that while the reporter said, you want to keep this all anonymous, by being honest about it, it's not about exactly as you said, it's not about shaming anybody for it. It's about saying, hey, here's where we were, here's where we're going now, and here's who I, Tysley, am going to be, or here's who I, Kim, am going to be today and tomorrow. Because I think a really important thing that I want to mention out of this is in creating inclusive perspectives, which is what all four of us are talking about tonight, we're going to make mistakes. We're not all, this is not a journey where we're all going to be perfect at diversity, equity, and inclusion tomorrow, but it is about owning our own discomfort, owning the ways that we dismantle what does professionalism look like, right? What does it look like to engage Millennial and Generation Z in working with baby boomers and Gen X in the workplace? And how do our different work-life balance and blends work together towards the same mission and goals? This is hard work. And Tysley, I think your personal story is really illustrative of that. And I'm grateful to you for sharing it. We do have a question. Actually, there came up a chat in a chat box here too from somebody saying it's so important we're having these types of conversations and really tearing those Band-Aids off to get to this real nugget of it. We've only got a few minutes left here. I do want to mention, and maybe Rebecca, I can start with you on this first with your member organizations. There is a question in here about If boards are meant to reflect gender, race, and other demographies of the communities they serve, what can we do to get all boards to understand the need to do this? How do we demand this? And I'll just quickly say, for our AUW members and advocates on today, obviously we know we do this together because we're in every congressional district in the US, and we can do that to advocate at a grassroots level, a municipal or metropolitan level, state and federal, and at the UN. But there's a lot that can be done. You don't have to wait for your policymakers, as Shyla pointed out, in California or many other states or nations for that matter. We don't have to wait for our policymakers to do this. We can do this in the organizations we serve right now. And I don't know, Rebecca, if you want to talk a little bit more about that in terms of the board level and the C-suite, and then I can turn to Shyla and Teisley.
Sure, and cognizant of our time, I would just say that I think that the conversations that we're having here and the intensity with which this has ramped up over the last year in particular, some of us have worked in this and around these topics for a long time, but I have seen in my 10 years with API a marked shift over the last year in the importance of these issues and the public awareness of these issues, and that matters. When you talk about publicly traded companies, when you talk about industries and organizations that serve communities and constituents and have customers, what is happening in the world around us matters and informs what I think those in our C-suites and on our boards are planning for the future. I do think that Shyla mentioned it's a long game and we're taking small bites and it's a little bit unsatisfying, but we're doing our best. And I think understanding that it's a long game and that we have to make this something that is sustainable and thoughtful and considered for the long haul so that this makes a lasting change rather than just, getting a few women on a board next year, I think is really important. But we do have to understand that the socialization here that's happening is impacting all of this. And so we need to be working to encourage those leaders, like you said, these 85% who are need to be allies, to learn and unlearn behaviors and attitudes that make the boards of the C-suite offices that we have right now more inclusive, where we can stop unwittingly disempowering or invalidating women or BIPOC, and instead find specific ways to change practices that don't facilitate equity and inclusion and make those changes now.
Thanks, Peggy, or thanks, Rebecca. I appreciate it. I do have another comment here, and I'll turn to Shyla and Teisley on this. Thanks so much, Rebecca, about the power of investment policies in this work as well. And we did talk a little bit about access. Money talks. We all know that. We did talk a little bit about the access to venture capital or investing in women and people of colors in their businesses, but there's also the power of investment policies or ESG investing, which is growing exponentially in this space, including in the nonprofit space too, and really socially responsible investing, where we're looking both at where the C-suite is, where the leadership and the board is, and are these companies exhibiting their missions in the same way? And that's a whole other area that actually we may want to have another webinar on at another time.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, but let me touch back again, and I'm going to ask this because I think a question came up today, particularly from a new BIPOC who's made it to the C-suite level and wanting to know where they can find more resources, support, mentorship, and sponsorship. And goodness gracious, is that a big topic as well? One that will—
That's the next webinar. We need that.
Yeah, that'll be another webinar, right?
Absolutely.
I will say on that, this is from Brianna Simpson, that there are some tools in our equity network at AAUW that you can find on our website, and we'll make sure and offer more of those opportunities next. But I do want to make sure and turn to Shyla and Teisley as well, if you have any remaining comments on some of these themes we've been talking about.
I'm really pleased to hear everything Rebecca mentioned because that covers all the points. And then this big issue of social responsibility in investing, I think that's becoming more and more an important factor because, as you will see, most of the stocks and bonds and anywhere that you wish to invest, your agent or whoever you deal with is pointing that out to you. Obviously, it's becoming an important issue. So that's one way of expanding it, exposing it, asking for that. But I do want to touch upon this topic from the point of accountability. What makes it all work if you're held accountable? And accountability is, in the world I'm in, science, technology, accountability is very simple, direct, and honest. It's easy in many ways because if you're not accountable, then you cannot deliver. If you don't deliver, your clients go away, you go away, and that's not happening on any entrepreneur's watch. So you are responsive. It's sink or swim. So accountability comes with measurement. Once again, measurement. We measure. We have quality and we measure. Where were we? Where do we need to be? Establishing quotas. People don't like quotas. It has all those horrible connotations. In California, we have Prop 209, which we managed to get onto the ballot, which was Prop 16, but it failed, obviously. So we're working on it again. Quotas has a bad connotation, but we have to go back and visit it again, because unless we say we want 25% of the board is BIPOC, female, diverse, whatever. And that raises another very important point, because what's happening with the dominant category is they're asking the minority categories to divvy it up amongst themselves. So then we are not a homogeneous, diverse group. There are many. So if we have one pie that we have to divvy up, whereas the main dominant group has a whole pie to themselves, then we're again uneven. So the quotas is an issue, and legislation to enforce those standards. That's really important. And education to train the leaders, to increase that awareness, because no matter how much you say things till blue in the face, you need to train people to see what that awareness looks like. Yeah. And then the incentives of carrot and stick. And for true change, we need the passion and the commitment to do the process and to understand that we, all of us, are the influencers of the process.
Very true.
Women, all of us in the civil society. And what's also happening is that governments, corporations, and civil society are understanding the importance of collaborating. Yeah. There is a middle space with CSR, ESG, and civil society realizing they need to learn the leadership of the other side. That's and right. They want the resources. And the other side wants to our leadership, our social impact knowledge, and so on. And it's not sides. We're all in it together.
That's right.
And I know I'm taking up time, but I do want to say that procurement and global trade are two fine examples of how this equity and removing or lessening biases and stereotypes has worked. It has worked because it's based on numbers, quality, and delivery. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shaila. Appreciate that very much. Taisley, any closing words for us? I will say, and I'll just close by saying, I think everything we have learned here is there is a lot of and, that this is an ongoing journey. There's not one path or one lever any one of us can push or pull to ensure that we're creating inclusive environments in every part of our society. Taisley, any closing words?
I'll simply just encourage people to continue to measure what matters. I think all of us share the same principles and values. And no matter where you take yourself, whether that's a job, whether that's a place of worship, whether that's an enrichment activity, empower yourself to hold those individuals within those institutions accountable to the values that matter most to you. And so, Kim, this has been a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Taisley. And a big thanks to Rebecca Winkle and the API team for supporting our webinar series and for allowing great conversations like this to take place. It's important we can all continue on this journey together. I know we'll look forward to future conversations, and some of you put some things in the Q&A that we know we'll be tagging on to have more dramatic conversations and pathways forward to really achieve equity in all that we do in all areas of our society. In closing, I'll just simply say that for all of us at AUW, we're grateful you could join us this evening. If you have any questions about tonight's webinar or things that were not addressed by our panelists, don't hesitate to reach out to my colleague, Nakia McFarland, at her email address right here on your screen. I know all of us are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we have to get beyond just our words and put together accountability measures so we can march forward together. I thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Rebecca, Tysley, and Shyla, thank you, and have a good evening.